the ITU. The ITU is a specialized part of the UN, International Telecommunication Union. It predates the UN. It's actually from 1865. And they originally were created to coordinate radio signals, or telegraph signals. And then it's evolved over the years to deal with other technology issues. So in the context of the ITU and working in the broader UN system, I was involved in a World Summit on the Information Society, which happened over the course of 5 years. It was a summit in 2 phases in 2003 and 2005, which always makes me feel old. I used to be the youngest person in every negotiation. I am no longer that anymore. But just to give you a sense of sort of history and where things were. And the output of those 2 phases of the summit, there was a Geneva Declaration of Principles and a plan of action, and also a set of documents that came out of Tunisia. And these are sort of foundational in terms of establishing some early on global governance regimes, how to deal with technology at the time. So fast forward 20 years, the output of the WSIS process created something called the UN Internet Governance Forum, which happens every year. The 20th one of those is this year, actually, in Norway, and a variety of other outputs that came from that. Because it's the UN, there's always a conversation about reevaluating and whether it should continue. So there's always an evaluation every 5 or 10 years about whether the system should continue. And the WSIS plus 20 process actually happens this year. And the decision-making element on that is actually a resolution that gets adopted at the General Assembly at the end of the year. So with 20 years of conversations around technology, Internet Governance Forum that's convened annually, organically local and national regional Internet Governance Forums have sprung up around the world. There's now 180 of them, and including youth elements to all of those programs and a youth Internet Governance Forum. I think for many of us, we were like, what's New York doing? Why is there another conversation on a set of issues that we've been involved in for so long? And I think that sort of, from my perspective, demonstrates some of the challenges between the conversations that happen in the New York ecosystem and the conversations that happen in the expert agency ecosystem of the UN, whether it's in Geneva or Paris or Addis or somewhere else. And so that's very much influences my perspective. So that's kind of what I wanted to sort of flat put out there in the first part. But the Global Digital Compact sort of evolved and came from a couple of things. Our current Secretary General really wanted to have a 75th anniversary big UN activity celebration. Unfortunately, COVID pandemic put a huge damper on that, and that could not happen. And so instead, the Secretary General was asked to sort of put together some ideas on gaps in global governance. And from that, the staff and his team issued a series of policy briefs, and there was one on digital issues. The original policy brief on digital issues, I think, for people that have worked in this space for a long time, was very not well received, because it was written and suggested that nothing had been happening for 20 or 30 years in the UN system on technology issues. And then that started this conversation and the negotiations and stakeholder input and attempts to actually have voices be heard in the UN system as member states then negotiated the Global Digital Compact. And we'll, I guess, talk about this as the conversation goes forward. But the Global Digital Compact had its own separate negotiation process. It got an annex to the Pact to the Future, so different co-facilitators and different processes. From my perspective, I thought it was particularly challenging to participate. I know that you all, and I heard some of the conversation this morning, was how does youth get their perspective into the conversation. But I think if you're not a government, sometimes it's hard to get into the conversation in the New York processes anyway. So I think there's a lot of people that would be in academia or civil society, or even as business stakeholders that would find common cause for you about some of the challenges of that process. But at the end of the day, last year we had a Global Digital Compact that was adopted. It sort of establishes and sort of reinforces some existing standards and norms, some existing goals that have been agreed to in other fora, recognizes the role of some of the other existing institutions like the ITU and dealing with digital divide and things like that. But there are a couple of key elements that are new in the Global Digital Compact that had not been adopted anywhere else. And the two specifically I'll highlight is one on AI. While there have been conversations on artificial intelligence in across the UN system, and in fact, the different UN agencies put out a very lengthy report demonstrating all the things that they've been doing, there's still a conversation about what should happen here in New York. And so a panel is being set up, a scientific panel to look at AI issues and try to provide some recommendations going forward. As far as I know, that's still in process, and the panel hasn't been named, the members of the panel. If anyone's ever been involved in any of these processes, just the selection of who's in these groups can be geopolitically fraught and complex. So that's ongoing. And the other work that was set up, that's a distinctly new issue line, is on data governance. And that's a working group of this Commission on Science, Technology, and Development, which is based in Geneva. And it's a working group on data governance. So both data governance and AI, newer issue sets that have not been covered in earlier UN documents. So it kind of makes sense to highlight that these are, I think, the newest things that are covered in this. The data governance working group kicked off its attempt to get organized 5 months ago. They just announced 2 weeks ago the 27 governments that are going to be members of that group. And then they've announced 27 non-government stakeholders that are going to get that group. So that group will just get going as well. So it'll be interesting to see both the scientific panel, once it gets named and gets going, and the data governance working group from the CSTD, what new things this adds to the dynamic of what's happening. But in terms of a lot of the other things that are in the Global Digital Compact, or things that are called for in the compact, the implementation of those actually will be happening or is already happening and has been underway in other parts of the UN. So there's a lot of conversation about how do you bring all this together? What's the best way to be most efficient in the light of what's likely to be a very reduced funded UN? And how does that work for the different institutions? I'll also point out that some of the specialized agencies like the ITU are not part of the UN budget. So they're funded separately. So they may not have the same sorts of challenges on funding that the New York system here in New York may have. But it's an interesting conversation, an interesting time. And I think, it's how do you reconcile and how do you deal with 20 or 30 years of discussions in the UN on technology. When I first started, people said to me, well, we had this Maitland Commission on Digital Development in the 80s. Why do we need something new? And we did a whole summit negotiation, right? So there's always this puts and takes sort of every 10 or 20 years about assessing where we are, how do we go forward, and how do you bring new voices into that conversation? And I think that's where the GDC finds itself. It definitely finds itself in the tension of how do you, especially with technology, where the infrastructure is not owned and operated by governments in the same way that other issue sets, governments have an outsized role. In the case of technology, corporations have an outsized role, for better or worse. So how do you develop norms and rules that involves them in a meaningful way? But also with technology being so much a part of your life, as you've described, how do you do this in a way that involves everybody that has an opinion, whether it's youth or whether it's academia or whether it's disadvantaged people or other stakeholders? And I think this is an ongoing challenge of the GDC implementation, and we'll sort of see how that goes going forward. So maybe I can stop there.
Thank you so much. I think that was an excellent opening statement, really giving some institutional historical light into the UN processes. So I'll move over to the second opening speaker, Leonard. Please go ahead.
Test. Okay. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and thank you so much, Fiona, for these very expansive introductory remarks. I'm not sure if there's much left to add, but let's see if I can offer a few additional perspectives. So just 2 sentences about my own background. I'm, so to say, wearing two hats in this conversation. When I was still a little bit younger, I was quite involved in all of these different forums that you mentioned. Internet Governance Youth Forum, national initiatives out of Europe. I was also working, with the UNESCO National Commission in Germany to, establish youth bodies and so forth. So I feel very strongly connected to the, to the effort of giving youth a voice in the, intergovernmental processes. But right now, first and foremost, what I dedicate myself to is AI research, right? I'm a doctoral researcher here in New York, and I'm doing very, hands-on work in machine learning, robotics, computer vision, and so forth. So throughout today's conversation, I want to offer a few perspectives also, wearing that hat in particular. And if, you don't take anything else away from the conversation but what I'm about to say, then it's these three key messages that I would like to send. The first one is, it is a good thing that we have the GDC now, period. The second one is, the GDC could have been significantly better. And the third one is, if we want the GDC to have a tangible real-world impact, it needs to leave the UN bubble. And I quickly want to elaborate on these 3 points, and hopefully we can dive into a conversation afterwards as well. So why am I saying that it's a good thing that we have the GDC in the first place? I'm saying this because it sends the right signal. And by that, I mean that the fact that after a very lengthy process of negotiations, specifically 3 years, but if you take all of the history into account, it's much more than that. In the current age, we're able to align behind a common set of guiding principles as the international community on how we want to shape digital technology moving forward, then that is a good thing, right? And I'm saying this considering fragmentation of multilateralism and growing nationalism, right? Now, particularly talking about AI, that holds here as well, because as we already touched upon just now, AI has a very prominent role for the first time in this type of process in the UN. Specifically, it means that out of the 5 objectives that are overarching for the document, one of them is entirely dedicated to it. And that, considering the significance of the technology, is something that I welcome. Now, if we zoom in a little bit and talk about the technical elements that the GDC proposes, then there's definitely a number of good ideas in there. Again, when we talk about AI, one thing that's being mentioned is that we want to emphasize and promote the development of open AI technology. That means open source models, open training data, open infrastructure. That is good. Second of all, there are being capacity building efforts proposed to explicitly encourage countries that have not really had their fair share yet in AI development to finally participate. And that is good for research as well, because you always start with adoption, but once you have the capacity locally, these countries, these institutions can also move into developing AI further. So we democratize that more, right? And then lastly, one thing that's very close to my heart is that it's explicitly mentioned that we also need to address the environmental impacts that AI technology currently has. And that the prospects of AI in that regard are not only positive, but that we need to address the energy consumption that it has right now. And even if you zoom out a little bit more beyond AI, right, there are good things for young people in general in this document. For instance, the first hurdle that you need to overcome, right, to be involved at all, is to have access to these technologies. And there's a very strong reiteration of that long-standing goal, right, that we want to have universal access to internet and digital technologies. So these are all good things. Now, why am I saying that it could have been significantly better? Because it's not a very consistent document, right? It's the result of negotiations, and you can tell if you dive deep into it. Again, coming back to AI, right? If you on the one hand ask for it to be open and democratized, right? Then on the other hand, you would also need to talk about the current concentration of power that certain actors in the AI field have, right? We see that a huge part of research and development is driven by a number of small institutions, both in the private sector and universities and research institutions that really dictate, in a sense, the agenda, just because they're concentrating so much of the brain power and also physical compute. So not mentioning this at all in the GDC is an opportunity that was missed, clearly. Second of all, climate in general is almost not addressed, right? Climate did not receive its own chapter nor its own section. It is only mentioned here and there as an element to other objectives. And considering the urgency and significance of that topic and the intertwinedness of it with digital technologies, that's clearly something that should have been added. And then lastly, because we're talking about youth here today, youth is not really being acknowledged as an independent stakeholder group in the governance processes that are being proposed, right? So whenever we talk about multi-stakeholderism, there's an array of groups being mentioned, but youth is a little bit left out there, which is unfortunate. And then beyond all of these things, we have some practical shortcomings, right? Funding is largely unclear right now on how these things are going to be put into practice. We're still waiting for an implementation roadmap. And clearly there is some duplication of efforts, which I think ties into what you said already, in how far the existing processes from WSIS and IGF and so forth are not going to be replaced, but coexist with new structures to be created. Which brings me to the third point, right? If we want for the GDC to have a real world impact, we need to think about how it can leave the UN bubble, right? And I want to explain it by this way. Again, the negotiation here took 3 years. We finally arrived at a document that was agreed by member states. And still, this fundamental document is still non-binding, right? So speaking very frankly, who should care about it, right? Like, who should actually care about it beyond the people that already work in these institutions or the people here in the room that have this inherent interest? Because what you need to keep in mind is that these days, technologies, particularly AI, are being moved forward by 2 actors, right? It's the research community, hugely, and it is the private sector who then commercializes these technologies. And these 2 actors, they respond to national regulation, but they don't really care a whole lot about what's happening on the international level, right? So we need to think about how we can make that translation from the international stage to the national stage, so that the actors that we care about, get into scope of the document. And I want to close with just one, piece of food for thought, which is that in the same time that it took us to develop and agree on the GDC, on the technological side, what we saw is the development from the very first introduction of ChatGPT in 2022 to technology these days, where an LLM can program an entire application for you, where video generative models can, envision whatever you have on your mind and put it out in a video, where robots can, slowly start to fold your laundry. So we also need to think about coming up with ways that keeps the pace with technological development and is agile enough for future developments to also fall under, the ideas that we are expressing here. So I'm going to stop here, and I hope that we can dive further into these things later.
Great. Thank you very much, Leonard. I think you brought up some really interesting questions, which I think we'll definitely pick up on later and respond to. But for now, we're going to move on to our third opening speaker. So, Georg, please go away. Please go on. That was a terrible Freudian slip.
I will stay here.
My dear Lord, I should walk out. Okay.
I'll ensure to be here for the next hour and to be part of this very important conversation that we're having today. And also, Chiara, you are not the only person today that found their way to this venue through the help of technology. I'm also guilty of that. I think this shows that technology impacts every part of our life nowadays, right? Like the ones that are lucky and privileged enough to have access to technology make use of it. And it is also, for example, what allows us today to have young people from around the world join us in this conversation who are not able to be in New York with us today. So just to kind of already introduce this thought that we have to also acknowledge not only the threats, but also technology as a tool, right? And I think what I always try to emphasize on is how can we ensure that we rather turn it into a tool and make sure everyone has access to this wonderful tool that technology can be, while still reducing the risks attached to it. And I think one important point that was really inspiring to me about what Leonard said is the point about stakeholders in the GDC. Stakeholders are being mentioned, and it's always this like multi-stakeholder approach, and then the stakeholders are being listed, the private sector, the UN member states. And what is missing? It's youth. Youth is missing there. At least it's not being explicitly named. And I think the big message that we can send as young people, and that's why I'm so happy to have inspiring young people in the room too, is reaffirm that young people are a stakeholder in this conversation. And I think the summit and all this energy that we've seen and that we will continue to see today at the summit shows that young people are a stakeholder, and that they are claiming their spot as a stakeholder in this conversation. And I'm very looking forward to discuss also in the course of this discussion, how can we promote young people more? And how can we also, what I also found really interesting is how certain points of interaction as young people were already mentioned, but how can we bring these wonderful forums? I think it was mentioned, the Youth Internet Governance Forum. I don't think any of my friends, even in the policymaking space, even in the youth activism space, knows about the Youth Internet Governance Forum. So I think it's important, how do we get these opportunities to shape digital governance to young people? And how do we make it more accessible? And now I got so inspired by everything you said that I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Georg Pinskin. I'm a Luxembourgish, German-Swedish youth advocate, but also a student at McGill University. And the 2 points that are very close to my heart, and which were also very important in my mandate, which I just concluded as the UN Youth Delegate of Luxembourg, where I attended the UN General Assembly, where education, youth well-being, gender equality, children's rights. And I think these issues sound like these issues that stand alone. Like we always tend to humans like categorize things, but I think the SDGs already in general, this whole conversation around it has shown that SDGs are all very interconnected, and we know all of this, but also technology impacts all of these fields. So when I was speaking, when I had the huge privilege to speak for Luxembourg's youth at the UN General Assembly, and I was able to speak about gender equality, about global youth health, one important aspect was always technology. And I think when it comes to, for example, gender equality, we were talking about rise of violence in these spaces. And it goes so much further than you might think. Like the rise of hate towards women and girls online can be a factor that keeps young women from claiming their well-deserved leadership positions. We had a huge campaign in Luxembourg, I think it was before a national election, I'm not sure anymore, of young female Luxembourg politicians openly telling the public how much hate they're experiencing, the messages they receive. So that is the thing, that is when I mention the threat that we have to address. And this is me speaking as like this gender equality and also mental health advocate, because also in the mental health, we see a huge field. That's a huge field that needs to be addressed when it comes to digital threats. I mean, the level of anxieties right now, and anxiety and depression and other mental conditions that are being maybe pushed by threats online is immense, and it needs to be addressed. But then also, maybe my other side, I can speak as an education advocate, and as an education advocate, I see the huge potential technology gives us in having inclusive education, bringing education to areas which are maybe not well connected. And I think we can really democratize access to a lot of things through technology. So that was me trying to explain what matters and why the GDC matters, because everything is moving, or a lot of things, if we want it or not, are moving towards the digital spaces. And we also have to acknowledge, even our children, young people, are moving so much of their activities into the digital spaces. And so how we will regulate this and how we will respond to this and how we will shape these environments will directly reflect on our society, but on our children and young people. And when I speak about children, I want to speak also, we cannot speak about children without speaking rights of the child. And I do think that that's one thing. I think we will have a lot of points where maybe we will say, okay, this could be made better in the JDC. But one thing I really want to emphasize before we go into the interactive session, which I look really forward to, is the rights of the child are mentioned explicitly in the JDC. And I think that's in the Global Digital Compact. And I think that's a very important step forward. And now we need to get concrete. We need to enforce these things nationally, because it's not a binding document, right? It's our principles that we set out as a global community, that the UN member states set out as a global community. And we need young people to be at the forefront of the advocacy that will then lead to concrete implementation of this that goes beyond these words in this, 16-page document, 16 pages around, I think, on the 16-page documents. And that's where I count on all these young people in the audience and who are watching online. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I think there were 3 wonderful opening speeches. And we're now going to move into a free-flowing discussion between our 3 speakers, and then we will move on to a Q&A. I'm sure you're all desperate to ask questions to our speakers. So for my first question is there anything in each of the other opening remarks that any of you would like to pick up on and respond to?
I will. So I think it's important to understand what the term multi-stakeholder actually should mean versus how people co-opt it to mean something that it was not supposed to mean. And I think, from my perspective, having negotiated around internet policy issues for 20 years in the UN system, the construct of multi-stakeholder was about making sure that it wasn't just governments in the room making decisions. There was a huge fight in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and the U.S. government had this very outsized role given its historical funding and oversight of a couple of critical underlying internet functions. I can talk to you at length about domain names, and I can if you'd like to later on, because I did that for a long time. But for this conversation, I think it's important to understand that there was this huge fight about whether global coordination of this underlying infrastructure that you use to access the internet should be managed in a UN system by governments only, or should actually reflect how the internet was developed. And the internet was developed, and IP-based networks and standards around the internet were developed in a bottom-up, open, participatory process. Your government didn't have to let you show up. You just showed up and participated, and that still exists today. The standards that underline our technology are developed by the Internet Engineering Task Force. It's anyone can show up if you're really into technology and internet stuff. They have meetings 3 times a year. They have a bunch of stuff online. You can do all of that. And so there was a big fight about multilateral versus multi-stakeholder. And one of the major outcomes of the WSIS process over 5 years of negotiations was sort of recognition internationally of multi-stakeholder and multi-stakeholder policymaking with respect to internet policy and these types of issues. And at the time, it was government or non-government. Those were the stakeholder distinctions. And in the WSIS process, it finally recognized that it wasn't just government, it was also the private sector, it was also civil society. And then over time, in the following WSIS processes, we recognized governments, private sector, technical community, which is a different stakeholder group, civil society, and academia. And I think it's important, you make a really good point, Leonard, that these documents don't specifically highlight now youth as a stakeholder group. And if you guys want that, you show up and you demand it. And that's how you make it happen. And that's how you make it show up in these documents. Because and again, my work and what I've been working for and for a long time is making sure that everyone has a say and everyone has a voice. And one of the things I didn't like about the GDC process, and I still think it's a detriment of how the New York processes work, was at the end of the day, for the last 2 months of this, documents were shared amongst only governments. Sometimes they were posted late, sometimes they weren't. And in the context of GDC, it wasn't even an open government negotiation. Governments didn't even actually get on a microphone. I mean, I'm used to actually having to go into a room full of people arguing about words on a screen or on a piece of paper, making my case and winning an argument to get to an outcome. And the way the New York processes work is you have facilitators, they listen to people, they propose a text, they come and try for a solution, there's all this backdoor conversation, and they put out a document and they put it under silent procedures. And they basically try to strong arm everybody to not object to it. And that's how they agree to something. And so when you're developing documents in that kind of construct, even your ability to influence as a government is limited, let alone another stakeholder group. So I think, just to sort of respond to sort of the conversation about getting youth more involved. And one of the reasons I keep pushing people more towards, not that the GDC is not important, but more towards our other existing systems, is you have more of a say. Because they were designed to respect your ability to have a say. You just have to know about them and you just have to show up. So I think I just wanted to kind of respond to that. And I think it's true. Youth is not highlighted because no one's demanding it. So you guys have to show up and demand it if you want it in the next one.
Yeah, I can maybe directly react to what Fiona said at the end, I think, which was a very interesting thought you were having on that we need to give young people, in order for them to effectively engage in these processes, we also need to give them the tools to know about it and to understand it and to meaningfully engage. I think one key point, and that's also mentioned in the GDC, is digital literacy, for example, and also I think we need to expand on this. Maybe Leonard can also talk about this. We need to expand it to technological literacy, because I think right now the school curriculums around the world do not reflect the level of technology we reached, and they do not reflect, they did not react yet to the huge progress which was being made. I mean, 2 years ago, or 2 or 3 years ago, ChatGPT came out, and then it was already telling us about how robots can maybe fold their laundry soon. I hope they will be able to do that soon. But I think that's one point. We need to make sure that young people are being empowered through education, driven by education, to take on leadership positions and be kind of this next generation of innovators, change makers, and regulators who will say, okay, I will create an ethical standard. I will think about what's an ethical standard that we need to fulfill. And when it comes to digital literacy and technological literacy, I think we should not forget about the ethical part of it, the human part of it. One word that is being mentioned also in the GDC is human-centric. So the question is, how do we bring this human aspect to technology? And I think that's something that young people will be able to do, or will be able to understand, because we are the first generation that grew up, at least the ones in the world that were lucky enough to be connected, to fully grew up immersed in this digital ecosystem. So we understand the risks of maybe this human touch in technology. And so we are the ones that should speak up on this issue, not only in New York, not only at the UN, because not every young person has this opportunity, but young people can speak up in national environments. I know this wonderful activist, and I invite you cordially to take a look at her work. Her name is Ava Smithing, and I will speak on a panel with her next week, also on mental health in relation to digital well-being. And she spoke on a national level in the US, and she spoke with key decision makers. And I think one key point in this also that I want to recommend people is, and young people, is if you want to achieve this change, and if you want to speak up and stand up, like Fiona said, you are not alone. There is already probably some organization in your country, maybe not in my small country of Luxembourg, maybe we have to start one there, but in the US, I know there is already an alliance of young people who work on digital governance that takes into account the needs of young people and that wants to prevent harm.
Great. Just on that point, I'd actually ask Leonard to come in on that specific element, if you don't mind.
If you don't mind repeating the specific element.
Like youth engagement on digital within the US.
In the US in particular.
Yes.
Happy to come back to that to the extent that I know about it, to be honest. I did want to touch upon a point that Fiona mentioned, though, which is the process and how we arrived with the GDC, right? And I agree with some of the assessments that the process was certainly not the most inclusive and transparent one that it could have been, right? And there's that dichotomy that I want to point out for a second, because we have this document now that, and I find that a very good thing, emphasizes that both for internet governance and for AI governance, these two processes should be multi-stakeholder by design, right? But then why did the GDC creation process lack that aspect in particular, right? Because the GDC in itself, yes, there was a consultative process in which stakeholders were able to comment on certain ideas in the initial phases, and for instance, the Youth Internet Governance Forum was able to submit a contribution to that. But then when it really got to the more interesting part, which is agreeing on the specific language, it was essentially governments only, right? And there were the facilitators that made these proposals. Some of them were not even publicly disclosed, or at least they should not have been. And that raises the question to me of whether we actually need these separate and very fancy creation processes that are being created, for instance, on the occasion of the 75th birthday of the UN, or whether we should start using the structures that were already created a while ago to exactly also produce those documents that will evolve their own structures further, right? So to be specific here, the IGF, which again is that annual forum where all of the stakeholders come together, has a mandate in theory to make recommendations, right? There's a mandate to talk about digital governance issues, and there is a mandate to issue recommendations. So if you really cared about including all the stakeholders, why did we not negotiate the GDC among all the stakeholders through the IGF process, for instance, right? So whenever you go outside of the processes that you already created, obviously you bypass some of the ideas that then you say you want to implement again. So that's just some food for thought that I wanted to share here. And then coming to like the specific opportunities for youth, I guess there is many things, at least, like in parts of the Western world also to a large extent, where certain institutions call for youth input, right? And sometimes that's just, on the paper, or that's very, like representative, and the youth that gets selected, comes from a very, let's put it like an elitist background, right? Which maybe makes it not as inclusive as it should be. And sometimes these processes are really bottom up, which is great. But I think one question that we need to ask ourselves is, where could youth be most effective, right? It's like if I woke up tomorrow and I would be like full of energy and I want to change something about our digital landscape, what would actually be the thing that I should choose to dedicate my time towards? And since I had some experience in the existing structures in the UN and also in my home country, Germany, I would almost venture to say that that's not the most effective way, right? Which brings me back to the first point that I was making, that technologies these days are driven so much by other actors, again, notably research and notably the private sector, which are much more admissible for youth, to get started and make progress in them fast. That if I, dedicate my time towards thinking about the next AI model from a technical point of view, that may have a larger impact in the same amount of time than me trying to advocate for the 100th time at the IGF or at the UNGA or whatnot for youth to, for instance, be acknowledged as a stakeholder group. So I think we need to be aware of what options youth have and make the policy side of it more attractive.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leonard. One thing that you said really inspired me, and I think it was on the kind of access to these spaces as young people, right? And this comes back to a greater issue, I think, within the UN system, and when we speak about youth advocacy. I'm in a very privileged position that I was able to represent Luxembourg's youth at the UN in the last session. But not everyone has this opportunity. It opened doors to me when a lot of young people around the world do not even get the chance to knock on these doors. And I think that's something that needs to change. And one point that I really want to emphasize is the representation of young people. And this goes back to technology and how we govern technology around the world and the digital divide between the global north and the global south. How do we ensure that the voices from the global south and low and middle income countries are being heard? Because they are being left out far too often. And because we often speak about the youth as if it's like this monolithic block, right? But the youth, it's not. It's so diverse. Youth is so diverse, and youth. It's across the world and in all its different forms. It was already a challenge to represent Luxembourg's youth. I know that's maybe 50,000 or something around that number at the UN. So I think we need to make sure that in these spaces, young people from the global south are able to speak up on this issue too. And I think a key mechanism that we need there, or maybe a key human trait that we need there, is solidarity. Because the young people that are already lucky enough to be in these spaces need to point out this issue to global decision makers and say, you need to facilitate, you need to fund, you need to give the resources for young people from these low and middle income countries to speak on these issues. And that's something we always collectively did, because I don't want to go too deep on this, but for example, the UNYD program, the UN Youth Delegate program, which exists, is voluntary. So not every country has adopted this program. And a lot of the UN Youth Delegates, a lot of my colleagues from other countries went to the Summit of the Future and could speak on this issue, and it's voluntary. And what you will see, and I think that's why Leonard's point on this kind of like elitist or at least like privileged point of view is not far off, because if you look at which country sends a UN Youth Delegate, in 90%, 80% of the cases, it's European countries, it's North American countries, it's Australia, it's not the global South countries often. So that's something we need to also take into account. How can we make sure when we have youth involved, when we have spaces that are open for youth, how do we get youth that is representative of the world situation to speak up on this issue?
Thank you. Those are all really, really great points. I'd like to pick up on what you've all been saying about like the, rapidly evolving challenges of artificial technology, the progression of technology itself, and, the other issues that go alongside it, such as gender-based violence, for example. So I think maybe for Fiona, do you have any perspective on whether or not you consider the GDC to be effective in tackling these rapidly evolving challenges as it currently stands?
So I think these documents that get agreed to in this UN framework are non-binding, as you guys have said, by design, right? And so they're only as useful as you make them, and as useful as you want to make them, if you don't like them. So I think that there's that to keep in mind. I think the place you can have more of an impact is in your local, national efforts, right? And some of the things we've talked about. We've talked about there's these like regional and local IGFs that have sprung up all around the world, and regional ones, several different versions in Africa. There's a North America one, which is actually just the US. I don't know, it's kind of North America. Canada has one, different things like that. But there's also something called the Internet Society, and this is a nonprofit organization who sort of is the umbrella home for some of the standards making processes. But they also have chapters all around the world, and they also have issue specific chapters. These are all free things to join, and you could join your local ISOC chapter. And those chapters do events locally, and then they also work together to develop positions that then get represented internationally or in the UN system, right? So, and those meetings are all going to be happening in your local neighborhood, right? And you can have maybe an ISOC chapter at your school. So there's versions of that in places where I think you can have an influence. At the end of the day, though, all of these global agreements in the UN system, even if it's a treaty, which again, the ITU, where I have a lot of experience, predates the UN, and so it routinely renegotiates 4 separate treaty instruments, which is a whole different exercise. And so technically the treaty would be binding once it's ratified by your national legislation, but you still have to implement it back at home. And so I think where you have the most influence on a direct outcome is local levels, right? And there's opportunities for that in this space. I think, again, speaking a little bit about the ITU experience, they have a development conference that happens every 4 years. And the last cycle, they actually had a youth summit. That was 2 days before their development conference, which was new for them. And governments, because it's a government delegation, it includes other, private sector and other people on their delegations, depending on how your country operates. But other countries, or all the countries, were actually invited to sort of sponsor or, authorize national youth delegations as well. And I know this because there's a group of students I was working with at American University, and they had been doing some research papers, and they went on the U.S. youth delegation to participate in the process. But the United States at the time also actually funded, I believe, 50 delegates from African countries to also show up as well. So the United States was contributing through a program I used to work with when I was in government, other countries' representatives in the meeting. And speaking to a couple of the students that I was working with that went to the event, I didn't even go, it was their environment. They were so excited. They came back with this great experience, and they negotiated a youth summit output document, which for the first time recognized and acknowledged in the ITU ever, again, 1865, LGBTQ issues. It was a big deal for them. And then that youth declaration got forwarded to the meeting of governments. And the whole conference almost cratered because some governments didn't want to acknowledge that statement that was in the document. So it was interesting. These students that got together, that went to this big meeting, that had 2 days of conversations around technology and all the things we're talking about, negotiated a document that then had to be reflected in a intergovernmental negotiation. And it was really interesting to watch that dynamic. So there's an example of finding a space and find a space that has some funding opportunities to show up and do that. I think UNESCO might do similar exercises. But I do feel like some of the expert agency parts of the UN, which have more bottom-up participatory processes, at the end of the day, they're still intergovernmental. And in treaty negotiations, governments are still voting if need be, but they have opportunities to be a little bit more open and a little bit more participatory. And a lot of stuff is online as well. I should also, while I'm here, point out that in terms of the internet infrastructure, how that's organized, the different governance arrangements around that, there's the groups that give out internet protocol numbers or IP numbers are structured regionally, and all of the RIRs have youth opportunities in environments you participate in. ISOC runs a youth ambassador program, and ICANN, which is the institution that's responsible for the global coordination of the system, every meeting, 3 meetings a year, has a fellows program and another program. And those are fully funded if you get accepted. So there are opportunities if you're interested in digital and technology. And these are all public policy conversations around these issues. So opportunities to participate in a way that might be useful for people online or in the room if this is a space that is of interest to you.
Yeah, if I can connect to that. First of all, I would like to share your excitement and promotion of the Internet Society, and it's really a great organization. I was exactly part of that Youth Ambassador program. That's how I got my activities in internet governance started. So certainly there are programs for young people out there, but of course, you need to know about them. I want to come back to your question regarding whether the GDC is well equipped to deal with the ever-changing nature of technology and AI in particular, right? And we, Fiona, I think in your introductory remarks you touched upon the elements that are actually being proposed, right? And I think there are, or at least the way I like to think about it is three major components that are being highlighted, right? Two of them are the introduction of two new bodies that are being proposed. One being an international scientific panel on AI, and the other one being a global policy dialogue on AI, as things that should happen additionally to the existing efforts within the UN system, right? And one interesting thing about the GDC process was that in the beginning, there were quite specific proposals about the job of these, new structures. And over the course of the negotiations, that got weakened and weakened. And now it's a little bit more uncertain what's actually going to happen. And it has principally deferred this decision to an implementation plan that is going to come out this year. So we don't really know what's going to happen, but the idea is that the International Scientific Panel will do some type of continuous assessment of the AI landscape, both regarding new opportunities as new technologies emerge, and also regarding an early warning mechanism for new risks that may emerge, right? So what that should be, what this is envisioned to be interdisciplinary by nature, I do welcome that there will be some scientists present and that they continue this effort that was already started in 2023 when the UN Secretary General first convened the, I think it was called the UN High-Level Board or High-Level Panel on AI, which essentially made recommendations similar to this. So that's a good thing. We know less about the global policy dialogue, which again sounds like something similar to the IGF, and we need to see in how far that's going to have an impact, if they will even produce output documents. That's all yet to be seen. And then the third element that I want to mention is a call upon standardizing organizations to, orchestrate the development of standards around AI, and first and foremost, make those interoperable, right? And that is something that many people forget about or don't, think about first when we talk about new technologies and their regulation, is that not everything needs to be policy or law, but at the technical level, decisions of what constitutes a good piece of technology are very, very important, right? So there are standards for everything. Everything in this room is standardized. And so there are also standards now coming up for AI. This is not exactly new, but if we strengthen the position of the standardizing organizations, I think that could be a good way forward to tackle some of the challenges that we have. So all of this is to say that it comes down to the implementation. We don't know yet exactly what's going to happen, but there are some interesting ideas regarding this document. And ultimately, we need to stay adaptable, right? Whatever gets decided, it shouldn't be rigid, so that in the next 5 years, when the next technology comes around, we start all of this over again.
Great. Thank you so much. I think at this point, I'd just like to open it up to the room in case there's any questions from the audience. Does anyone have any? Okay.
Well, thank you all for a very insightful discussion. I was listening to you guys talk about the importance of not only providing access to digital spaces for youth, but also the importance of youth speaking up and demanding those spaces. And there are, of course, barriers to both sides of that. And this question might be different to the three of you, but in your work and your experience, what has been the most persistent barrier and recurring one that has been just so hard to overcome in current spaces? And looking ahead, are there any barriers you kind of foresee coming up that would be helpful for us to think of preventative measures from now? And yeah, thank you.
Okay. Who would like to respond first?
I mean, I can just jump into it.
Sure.
Thank you so much. What was your name, sir? Noor?
Yes.
Thank you so much for your question. And so if I understood correctly, your question is, what was the biggest barrier when it comes to the meaningful youth inclusion, right, in digital governance? And I think that's crucial because we have to reaffirm, and then I will get back to your question, we have to reaffirm that the GDC needs to meaningfully, and I really like to emphasize on this point, meaningfully, not just in a way that like we take a picture with young people and we say, well, young people were consulted. Meaningful means integrating young people, not just letting them participate on the margins, right? So I think first of all, maybe one barrier is this kind of like tokenistic nature of some of these like policy making processes that like we say we listen to young people, but how did you listen? How did you ensure that what young people said, what young people contributed, actually was translated into policy? So we need mechanisms, accountability mechanisms that ensure that this is happening. But I'm happy and I'm quite optimistic knowing that there's a big group of young people, but also policymakers who know how important the inclusion of young people is. And I also hearing about the Internet Society. It's the first time that I hear about it, but it's very encouraging. And then I think I already touched upon this, but one important barrier is young people not having simply the tools, knowledge, awareness, information, education to meaningfully participate. Because you don't only need the space, because once you have the space, you need to be able to, you need the skills, right? You need the knowledge on it too. You need also to be empowered from a young age. You need this idea in your head that my thoughts on this are valid. My thoughts on this are important. And because I might be 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and so on. But my what I think still matters. And that's something that we can start very early on. And I'd like to maybe share like also personal connection to this. My first ever participation in the youth and youth representation was, I think, already with 9 or 10 years when we had in our local, in a very local, very small. I grew up in a village, maybe in Luxembourg, with like 1,000, 2,000 inhabitants, and they had I will say it in Luxembourgish, a Kammerrat, a children's council. And we need, I know this is maybe goes a bit far, but that's one of the points where we can start. Okay, if we one day want maybe a 21-year-old sit on a panel, sit in a room to take decisions or to at least contribute to decision making, we need to plant the seed in the head very, very soon, very early, that young voices matter. And that can be done. And I think, Fiona, you mentioned this localization, this really local aspect of it. That can be done and it should be started in a very local context, in schools, in primary schools, in kindergartens. I'm not saying that we need kindergarten children in a meeting with the president, but they should be encouraged to say what they think, what their needs are. And that's where it starts. So yeah.
Great. Yeah, I think it really goes back to autonomy and agency. Leonard, do you want to come in?
Yeah, maybe just to very quickly add 2 specific points, just directly to your question, at least in my experience, and also what are the big problems that we still need to overcome. First of all, very clear funding, right? Nobody wants to pay. Not even for non-youth things, people want to pay, right? Look at the UN right now. We have major donors withdrawing their support, that cascades into a whole movement, and all of a sudden, multiple UN agencies are in crisis, right? And youth will certainly remain the last priority. And similarly, in the GDC, even before what I just mentioned happened, there were some, in the initial version, there were some bolder commitments towards funding the existing multi-stakeholder structures, which involves youth, right? Such as the IGF. Because so far, IGF has been funded separately outside of the UN budget, right? So they wanted to strengthen that. And in the end, again, after negotiations, they were not really able to keep that in the document. Now it just says, okay, come up with a voluntary fund to promote diverse participation. That's still better than nothing, but compared to the original language and the original ideas, it falls very short, right? And the fact that these forums that we do have, for whatever reason, are not well funded enough to then also get youth in particular involved, that's a big problem. And then second of all, it's really the process, and I'm not sure if there's going to be an easy solution to it, because from my experience, right, like these youth processes, what they do is they collect the input of youth, and in the best case, there will be some type of output document, youth messages or whatnot, and then you send that into the void, and you never hear anything back, right? And if then the actually deciding people or the deciding institution in the follow-up negotiations decide to not pick up on any of the things mentioned, then there's no way to challenge that. So is there a way to have youth not just be an input to the main process, but for them to be part of the main process? I think that's the question. But I see big obstacles towards getting there. So, but yeah, these 2 points I just wanted to mention. Yeah.
I think it's a really good question that you asked. And when I sort of reflect on my experience in government, doing negotiations for 20 years, and then my role now outside of government, sort of observing or commenting or trying to participate in processes, I think one of the most persistent challenges that I've seen over the last 25 years is governments themselves. And I say this in the nicest possible way, but every country and every national government has a different view on what's the role of government itself, right? And this is reflective of your culture and how your country was developed and things like that. And when you try to bring that into the UN system and bring it all together, you end up with the least common denominator. And so while you might have some governments that are more open at home, when they come into the UN system, they become less open. And I think that's one of the most persistent things. And I think, to the extent that technology is enabling your life in this amazing way, and my life has changed so much, I grew up without the internet and then, have the internet. So I understand the pre and current worlds. That challenges the role of government, right? And governance. And I think that's what I see as the most persistent challenge. So what we're arguing for is a more open, participatory, bottom-up system where everyone has a say, whether that everyone is youth or a different stakeholder group. And that means for some governments, they're in less of control. And I'm not suggesting this is just an authoritarian country issue. This is an every country issue, right? Countries that you might think should be more open end up not being more open. So I think that's what I've seen as the most persistent challenge. I mean, I talked about the 5 years of the WSIS process and my negotiations in that. And that wasn't just 2 meetings. That was 5 years of constant meetings. We would have these PrepCom meetings that were 2 weeks long, and there was 4 or 5 of them a year, and you're sitting in Geneva or somewhere else, and you're negotiating over words and you're making proposals. And when that first started, it was only governments in the room, right? And people showed up and banged on the door, and internet stakeholders and civil society and technical people were like, yeah, we have a say. And we had to negotiate an entire separate rules of procedure to allow them into the room. At the time, our ambassador that was leading our delegation through the whole process gave us an instruction as the US. So for every small group negotiation I went into, I had to take the floor at every meeting and demand that stakeholders be allowed in the room. They weren't, but we had to make that intervention every single time until there was a system that allowed people to actually be in the room, right? And this is before there was no internet, there was no webcasting. We used to show up to these meetings with a little suitcase with all of our paper documents. Like, there was not this online system in a way that allows for all of that. So I think, back to your question at heart, like governments appreciating that everybody should have a say in a system like this, I think for me is one of the most persistent challenges, and in a reality that it will exist in this system for a while.
Thank you. Those are 3 excellent responses to a great question. So I'll open it up to the floor again. I see your hand was first. Would you like to come up, or do you want to shout it?
I can shout it.
Okay.
Thank you all for sharing your opinions, and Fiona, that was a really interesting insight at the end about how you were able to get kind of private stakeholders' conversation. It sounded like it was a real persistent thing, but I was just kind of wondering then, what is the barrier to doing that for you? Like advocating at every negotiation at every stage, you have representation there as well. Because I think as a young person, it is really hard to just show up. Showing up comes from privilege. It comes from being able to speak English or French in these conversations as well. So I was kind of just wondering, has that ever been a conversation internally? Has anyone thought to just advocate at every single chance to be able to
Thank you so much. I'm just going to have to repeat the question for our online participants. So the question is essentially about barriers to advocacy and showing up, and whether there's like internal conversations, and it's directed towards Fiona.
So I'll say, at least my experience in the early days of this, and why the U.S. government, and this was in the Bush administration, this negotiation happened, why we were so pushy and demanding the room be more open, was because the internet and the infrastructure that it rides on is owned and operated mostly by non-government agencies, and the U.S. government at the time was very against this idea of multilateral government-only decision-making with respect to these issue sets. I was pleased in Geneva last week. They're still have that position. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen this time, but that's where they are in terms of the statement they made last week. And that was why we kind of pushed for that. But it was also because, our domestic stakeholders knocked on the door, right? I was 28. I was new to this, right? And the ambassador that I worked with and my colleagues in the State Department who ran the process had done this for a long time. A lot of them are used to much more intergovernmental sessions. So a lot of this is people sort of showing up and finding the right people to advocate for you. I will say that there are a lot of processes now, and we've talked about some that you didn't even know about, right? The Internet Society processes, the ICANN processes, the RIR processes, the national. So there's lots more venues for you to kind of push and demand for this. And, in the context of a youth IGF or something like that, if there could be momentum or a push in a couple of different places that, in the same way that the technical community was like, hey, we want to be referenced in these documents or whatever it is, if you could have a bottom-up momentum, you get a couple of countries that will take that up and they'll make that intervention every single time. But it's about getting sort of a momentum going and then finding a couple of key people that will take that up. But again, and then it just becomes organic. I mean, I used to do a lot of negotiations across the OECD and other venues. And my job in the US government was to kind of map out strategically how to deal with different issue sets and how do you get a global consensus to emerge on an issue. You decide what you want and you figure your top 3 lines and you get that reflected in every document, whether it's at the OECD or whether it's at APEC or whether it's in the UN. And then people start looking at these documents and they're like, oh, people are all saying the same thing. It takes a little bit of work, but that's how you do it.
If I can just add on this question, because I find it interesting, and I want to use it as an opportunity to also shed light on how we can bring more young people on board, and also how we can try to democratize access to youth participation and how it can be amplified. So I think when it comes to ensuring that young people can do this, there's 2 things that we need. We need the community aspect. I think we have to trust the power of community, and I trusted the power of community in a lot of instances. And right now I'm also about to launch a global initiative on mental health, which also connects back to digital well-being. Will be launched next week. But just to say, in this regard, I was not alone. And you have to start entering a network. And I think that's the important part. How do young people from maybe less privileged backgrounds enter these networks? How can they knock on these doors and get in? And I think that's something where we need policymaking still, and maybe also a bigger effort within civil society to ensure that young people from backgrounds which are underrepresented make this first step. Because what I noticed within the UN system, once you are in it, you can stay in it. Once you are, as a young person, you are participating in these processes, you have the network to continue having a voice where you want to have a voice. Mm-hmm. I want to shed light on a self-governed mechanism for youth representation within the UN, which is the MGCY, the major group for children and youth, which allowed me, for example, after my mandate concluded as a UNYD, to represent this self-governed mechanism at the ECOSOC Youth Forum, which is happening next week. And I'm pretty sure they have a lot of constituencies and a lot of subgroups. And I'm sure that they also have one dedicated to information technology. So if you are interested in that, reach out to the MGCY and become a member of this. And then also, one last point, was the universities that were mentioned. And of course, universities are also a space of often privilege, but still we have to recognize that academia and young people in academia can also be a force for good in these spaces. And there's, for example, some universities who sent their delegations to these processes. I'm from McGill University, and I have a lot of my friends are active in the McGill Youth Advisory Delegation. and they're ECOSOC accredited, and they send delegations to UN summits. And I think that also exists in other universities. I'm not sure. I've already met people from Columbia. I mean, they're in the city, very important. But I met people from Columbia University at side events during the UN General Assembly. So I do think we can try to create these networks. And if there is no network in your space, be a young person that creates one, that advocates for the creation of it. And it also goes back to the UN Youth Delegate Program. If your country does not have a UN Youth Delegate Program, please advocate for it and rally for it. Thank you.
Great. I just want to point out there's someone from Columbia University sitting right beside you, so you can create these networks here. I'll just open up the floor to more questions. You've been waiting, so do you want to come up and speak it? Perfect. And please introduce yourself as well.
Absolutely. So it's going to be a long question, if that's okay with you.
Go ahead.
Okay, so my name is Alexander Elgart. I am a graduate student at Seton Hall School of Diplomacy. And I have been doing, one of the researches I've been doing is in regards to digital inclusion and the SDG, and particularly both 16 and 17. So one of the things that I have been concerned about, or at least interested in, is that digital inclusion in of itself it works separately for each different region or country. And in that regard, a lot of governments, they don't adhere or open up to the possibilities of digital inclusion, youth development, mainly because there is more cost and benefits to them, and long-term investments don't really benefit much as, let's say, road infrastructure. And that is a problem in countries and for the youth in mixed and authoritarian regimes, because the lack of digital inclusion also increases the possibility for more state corruption, elite entrenchment, and less transparency laws. Recently, there have been initiatives, say the UNDP, in order to combat in terms of digital literacy and provide more digital infrastructure towards communities that have marginalized rural and vulnerable communities in general. And I'm just wondering, what could the GDC, as well as the practical facts that are involved, how can governments that are hesitant to open themselves up to more transparency that includes digital inclusion to other countries, how can they be convinced that through initiatives by, let's say, NGOs such as the GDC or the UNDP that could help open up the youth to digital literacy and involvement within their governments and make a better change within their societies as well?
Thank you so much. That's a really excellent question with a lot to chew on. So, okay. Fiona, can I come to you first?
Sure, I can try to answer. And also, just to point out, I mean, the SDGs, which are important to a lot of people, there's no digital SDG, right? It's a problem. And it's a problem because the SDGs were negotiated in this closed UN system and weren't part of the broader UN system. Again, there's definitely some tensions in the UN New York system versus the expert agencies. And there's been a lot of work to try to bring this together. And the GDC was actually a missed opportunity because you could have actually tried to bring together the Sustainable Development Goals, all the other existing related things, and put them all together as a path forward. And I think some of the more interesting proposals did that in the early days, and those were also stripped out for a variety of reasons. Speaking to some of the internal warfare I would describe between different parts of the UN, but also how governments think. But to get to your question about digital inclusion and how do you actually convince other players to do what you think is right, you've got to find a way to talk to people in a way that's going to resonate with them, right? So I didn't show up at UN meetings with a very welcome audience when the argument was I got yelled at in the room as one person for controlling the internet. And I'm like, nobody controls the internet, right? So you have to actually start a conversation with people and find ways and places to have that conversation, because what you're trying to convince them is that there's a better outcome for them. There's a better system at the back end if it's more open. And that just takes perseverance and it takes time. And when I look at where this conversation started, at least for me, when I first started doing this, where it is now, there's been so much progress. progress and so much change. And I think people tend to forget that. They focus on, oh, I have this issue today and it's not right and that's happening. And which is why I kind of bring up some of the history of it used to only be these people in the room. And slowly we've been making the case and people see there's better outcome when there's more people in the room and there's more participation. So it takes perseverance. It takes finding, the right person or the right institution or the right group of people that might have an ability to influence that process or that country or that thing as well. So it takes a little bit of legwork, but it takes showing up and it takes perseverance. It takes I think a recognition, like international diplomacy is not for people that are looking for a quick return on investment, right? There's definitely it takes time, right? And sometimes you have to show up and meet people where they are. You can't not talk to people. So you have to start that conversation and do that first. But it's not a place where you're going to find usually a quick solution and get in one meeting a good outcome, right? It gets a slow process. So I don't know if that helps you or makes it sound harder, but it does have an impact and things do change. And I should say, digital inclusion and connectivity used to be called, I talked about this Maitland Commission report from the 80s that kind of highlighted this, and then the term digital divide. And then the ITU has been working on digital divide issues and has this goal of connecting people. And they've made huge strides in helping facilitate that. The ITU has a bunch of governments that come together and develop standards, and there's connectivity development programs, and they have some other partner to connect programs they've made, and they're trying to bring together pledges to actually fund things. But I'll say even here in the United States, we have a huge digital divide. And in the last couple sessions back of Congress, we have $55 billion going out in the United States right now to build connectivity in this country alone. We have huge digital divide programs, even inside the United States, which you wouldn't think. So part of that is kind of having governments come to the conclusion that it's worth investing or it's worth figuring out how to spur private sector investment, and it's worth doing all that. So there's a whole series of issues and projects and efforts around digital inclusion, digital literacy, and getting sort of marginalized people connected, even here in the US. That's worth taking a look at, but it's hard, right? But it's meaningful. So you just got to keep pushing, I guess, is my advice.
Great. Leonard, do you want to come in? And for time, I'll ask you guys to keep it to maybe within a minute.
Yes, let's see if we can do this. Just a few thoughts that I had when you brought up your questions, and thank you for that. As far as I understand, pretty much since the beginning, since the World Summit on the Information Society in 2003, and you know that better than me, but I think that issue was already been mentioned explicitly there, right? The digital divide, and my impression is that ever since, whenever we talk about internet governance, technology governance on the UN level, there's almost always support to address this issue. I never find it to be very controversial to at least have some type of clause on that, right? And that countries want to work on that. So clearly, it seems to be more of an implementation issue than a policy issue, even though you could always obviously advocate for more on the policy level. So I wonder why that is, right? And does that just mean that countries have such a vastly different interpretation of the goals that they agree on, that then, they are happy with different types of standards that they see in their country? Or, is it a lack of resources maybe? And I would definitely say that the lack of resources is a big factor to consider, right? So talking about funding again, one of the things that the GDC does for AI capacity development, and that is what I mentioned in the very beginning, is setting up a new and unfortunately, again, voluntary fund where countries can contribute, their means towards enabling AI in countries that historically have had less access, right? And try to establish new programs there. So I would say there are some good initiatives, but there has not been, mostly because nobody can, I guess, that one fundamental decision to allocate the resources needed to solving the problem. You can only always agree on the political language, but that doesn't mean that the countries will have the means to do it. Yeah.
And I promise that I will formulate my thoughts concisely. I think one thing that we have to do in these conversations and this very important dialogue that Fiona mentioned is show these political leaders why is it important that this is being implemented, and how is this related to what has already been agreed on. And I think one thing that needs to be done is show our common goals. So what is one of the common goals that we have as a global community? It is to ensure children's rights, something that has been agreed on decades ago. And I think we need to explain and emphasize, especially as the ones that are in terms of age closest to children, so young people our age, have to show that our capability to address and implement protection of children online, regulate digital spaces, will decide whether or not human rights, but I think also really this emphasis on children's rights is important, whether or not children's rights will be upheld in the future. And so if we make this clear, then global leaders have a strong mandate, or also our friends in other countries have a strong mandate to make a good and clear case for why this has to be implemented, so we can get away from the implementation problem and get to an implementation success.
Perfect. There might be just one more question, and I really want everyone to ask a question that they, have space for it. So, do you want to come up, or do you want to shout?
I'll just shout if that's all right. It was said that regulation or resolutions on tech needs to keep up with the pace of tech development. Sometime in the conversation, I don't remember when. Since tech develops so exponentially, what can be done specifically to develop a robust or long-standing legislation or framework that keeps up with the pace of tech, so that we don't have to keep going back every few years, re-regulating, and as was said before, the system takes a very long time to produce anything, and at that point we move past this moment. So what can be done to manage that?
Great. That's a really fascinating question. I think I'll ask Leonard to come in, and then Fiona.
Yeah, great question. I wish I had an answer for you. I think we need to change something, and I think people have different opinions on what that needs to be, right? And I guess to an extent, this debate is also reflected in the different camps that we have seen around the GDC introduction, right? There were some people that said, yes, let's do it. We need a flagship document. Let's talk about AI and whatnot, right? And then there were some people that said, look, we have so many structures. Do we really need that? And I think there's a balance to strike, right? I said in my introductory remarks that I think that the signal that agreeing on the GDC sends is very powerful and important. So I would, stick to that. But in the long haul, right, we probably need structures that are a little bit more flexible and agile so that they can deal with different types of technologies, right? And in that sense, the GDC maybe has missed a bit of an opportunity. That even though the focus on AI is right, it does not include, a bigger conversation about other emerging technologies. And interestingly enough, that is again something that was removed over the course of negotiations. In the beginning, that fifth objective that highlights AI right now, I think it mentioned something along the lines of emerging technologies, including AI. And now we only talk about AI. So it's very hard to agree on something that has a very big scope, right? So I guess sometimes on the political side, member states have an easier time to talk about one specific thing instead of thinking about the meta level and what structures may be needed that can scale with the new challenges of future technologies, right? That being said, though, I think we need to acknowledge that other institutions, like, for instance, the institutions that set standards, and particularly research, which is so incredibly fast-paced right now with emerging technologies, that those are able to respond quickly. And we just need to see how can we get them in sync with what policymakers also ask of these players. So yeah, it's an open challenge.
Great. Fiona, and then? Yeah.
So I think, regulation and legislation happens at national level. It doesn't happen at the global level, right? You're going to have some broad-based international agreement. And even if you get to one, even if it's a treaty, you're still implementing it at national levels through your own domestic legislation. And I think, how do you actually deal with technologies and technology policy through domestic regulation and processes also depends on which part of the world you live in and how countries operate. In Europe, the role of commission versus the member states. In the United States, Congress and the administration and the trade-offs there. I will say that in the Obama administration, when I was there at the time, we actually took this issue on with respect to privacy, and we actually tried to offer a flexible framework to deal with what you're saying. And my boss at the time was really adamant that we should have basic privacy rights that everyone should be able to understand, not the click-throughs that are so long that nobody reads, but some fundamental rights on privacy that should be enshrined in legislation. And so the administration put out this privacy blueprint. I think it's still online somewhere. And there was 10 simple, clear, 1-line, 2-line sentences. He's like, it's got to be understandable to everybody that these are your rights as a U.S. citizen when it comes to privacy online. And so we put that out and we called for Congress to legislate what was referred to as a privacy bill of rights. Now, the specifics on how to implement those Bill of Rights, we proposed that there be these multi-stakeholder processes that we convene domestically here in the United States through the agency I worked in. Those processes would be open to all stakeholders. You could show up, the stakeholders would pick the topics, and that was flexible because then you could adopt and you could change and you could develop recommendations or standards, whatever you wanted to call them, through these processes that my agency would convene that were implementing this Privacy Bill of Rights. Then, once a recommendation was approved and stakeholders agreed to it, and a company stood up and said, I'm going to abide by that recommendation, it's enforceable in the United States through the authority of the Federal Trade Commission. So all we needed was Congress to legislate 10 one-line sentences, and we were going to try to implement all of that. And I will say that this was like 2012, and this was a way to try to implement baseline, clear framework, have a process to update as needed on a rotating basis and constantly evolving basis, and enforce it through our own domestic rules. And that legislation got tanked by U.S. industry at the time. So yeah, that was our way of doing it.
And again, I will add a very short thought because I know our brains are probably slowly starting to think more about lunch than digital governance. But this point is very important for me to make. It is maybe to approach this also question that you had on this rapidly evolving landscape and how we react to it from a bit an outside of the box approach or from a different perspective. I think what is important is that we introduce and that we set up, and that is something that the Global Digital Compact already did, that we introduce certain guidelines, standards that are timeless and that can be applied to any level of technological progress. And these are human-centric, human rights-based, and ethical standards, guidelines for policymakers, technology creators, so all the sectors, to know what are our red lines, what are ethical red lines, and what are our goals when we create technology for society. And then that can be applied on a case-by-case basis. But we need to agree first as a global community, what are these standards? And I think that's why the Global Digital Compact is a good step in the right direction.
Thank you very much. I could sit here all day listening to these speakers, honestly. I think it's a really, really fascinating conversation. But we are approaching lunch, so we will all let ourselves go for lunch. So I'll wrap it up. I think the discussion we've had has been really interesting, three very different points of view. But then also, I think we've talked a lot about processes during this discussion and how exactly we can get involved and keep on talking. And I really liked your little comment about the situation with the students who came together. They made this resolution, which was then adopted and brought to a larger forum. And I think if you're considering, what can you do right here, right now, when a lot of digital technology feels like so far away, so remote, and you might feel like so powerless to change anything, it is to keep talking, keep showing up, keep making friends, and keep coming to conferences like this and chatting to each other. So I'll bring it to a close now, but I encourage you all to talk to the speakers afterwards, talk to people around you, and then, submit something about tech to the global resolution. So thank you all very much. And thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.